Hello, everyone. I'm Gary Summers, and welcome to the audio edition of Mind, Body, Soul. I'm here with the second interview with lawyer Denis Berry, and I'd encourage you to go back and listen to the first interview last week, where Denis talked about wills and what you need to know about wills and what you need to put in them. So, welcome back, Denis Berry.
Thank you. Great to be back, Gary.
So, Denis, another area that you're very familiar with is family law. And I wanted to get your views on some of these things, because as we know, people go through separation and divorce, and they have kids, and what do you do, and things like that. So I guess the first question is common law marriage valid?
Well, common law is not a marriage. Marriage is regulated by the Family Law Act. You have to be a spouse to come under its ambit. But partnerships, relationships are perfectly legal, but they're not marriages. People don't go through forms of marriage, you know. They decide to live together, co-partner, whatever you want to call it.
So if you're co-partnering in common law, you and your partner, would the division of property and everything, if you decide to separate, work the same way as if you were married?
No.
Okay.
And I'll just explain that. I'm not a family law expert, but I can tell you that people are becoming more and more likely to co-partner than marry.
Right.
Marriage is becoming almost obsolete.
Right.
It's being recognized across the country, both provincially and federally, that it should be recognized as a form of marriage. But in fact, marriage has a definition.
Sure.
It'll never be a marriage. So there are provincial legislations across the country and federal legislations that will essentially recognize a person as being legally entitled to benefits under legislation like pensions and things,
right,
because they've cohabited for periods of time, usually around 12 months.
Oh, so
federally.
1 year, okay.
1 year, that's federal. So if you were in a relationship with a federal employee and that person dies, you'll get a spousal benefit for the pension, that sort of thing, health benefits.
For the amount of time that you were living with that person?
No, if you live with that person for, let's say, the required 12 months, and you represent each other as committed partners, married couple, as if, then you will be entitled to the benefits of a spouse as if you were a spouse.
Okay. If
there is a death or whatever. But what happens with common law relationships is it's really subject to a review of the facts if there should be a breakup. And you have to look at it and say, did they share everything equally? Did they buy property equally? Did they name each other on life insurance, things of that nature? That's all pretty straightforward. But automatically, it doesn't mean if you break up, you're entitled to 50% of your husband's pension or the partner's pension or the wife's pension, that kind of thing. That's not the case. It's not the same thing. What I do, and I encourage everybody who's thinking about getting into a relationship like that, is to organize in an agreement. And it could be called a cohabitation agreement. It could be called a prenuptial agreement if you're actually thinking about marriage.
Is that something you do yourself, or is that something they go to you to do?
They should come to me to do it, but they can. But what the idea is that if you want to preserve what property is yours, and the partner wants to preserve what they have, then you document it and say, what's mine is mine, what hers is hers, including things like not just assets, but your debt and also your pensions and your severance entitlements, and things that you would package and say, I own this, you own that.
And that's in perpetuity? That's forever?
It could be, but in the agreement you can say this would not change if you got married, or it could change if you got married. This will not change if I die. This can be revoked. You can say all those things in that agreement, right? But it's not automatic. It's not like a husband and wife.
Okay. In a marriage, is division of property always 50-50?
No. Mostly. But
when would it not be?
Well, first of all, there's exemptions under the Family Law Act as to what is marital assets. marital assets are everything other than your matrimonial home. So the Chesterfield, the car, all those are marital assets. Pensions, severance, all of that are marital assets. The exemptions to them, though, make division a lot of times unequal, because inheritances are not marital assets. They're not divisible. Personal injury awards are not marital assets. That sort of thing. There's a list of things. Business assets. You own a business.
Winning a lottery ticket.
Winning a lottery ticket is not an exemption. You have to divide it. But the reality of it is that business assets are an issue. I run a business. Does my wife have an interest in this business? Well, that at times becomes very disputed. Well, I helped my husband start his business.
Right.
I helped my husband paint the shop. I helped my husband pay the bills. I did this. If your spouse does things for you in a business asset, but you pay them reasonably for it, they don't inherit an interest in a business asset. But a lot of times people hide their money through businesses, so that becomes contentious. Right?
Okay. When we look at child support,
Yep.
is that always determined by a chart? This is your income, this is how many kids you have, this is what you pay.
Yeah, virtually. The only time it's discretionary is when you reach a high level of income. And I believe the levels are 300,000, and don't quote me on that. You're going to quote me on that because I'm on radio. But the reality of it is that's fine. There's a scale, there's a chart, and the court will bind itself. So it's based on gross income. And so if you make $89,000 a year in Newfoundland, you got 2 kids, it'll tell you exactly what you got to pay. And there's no ifs, ands, ors about it, right? So that is easy enough. But if I'm a doctor making $600,000 a year, or a lawyer like myself making a lot more than that,
yes, and you deserve every penny.
I'm only kidding you. But the reality of it is that then it becomes a discretionary issue for the judge, and the judge can award virtually anything he or she feels appropriate.
So, as someone who's divorced, and that person is paying child support, and they remarry someone,
right.
Is their spouse's income calculated in that child support?
No, their income is not calculated. But the problem with that is, and not a problem, but the issue is, okay, my expenses now are not near as much as they would be if I was sitting alone. So the reality of it is that factors in.
Okay.
Child support doesn't. But in spousal support, it factors in. Lots of spouses will say, he's married to a doctor, so he should be able to pay me more money. Well, no, that's not the way it works. But his lifestyle, his expenses are far less, so he can pay more to her.
What would you say to a parent who right now is not being able to get child support from the other spouse? They're just not paying two situations. One if it's a court-ordered one, and one if there's no court-ordered. Because some people just put their hands up and say, I've tried everything.
Well, they haven't tried everything. See, if they try to do this alone and get, let's say they get an agreement, they have no idea really how much the other person should be paying them. The child support guidelines are available publicly, so they can look down and say, well, you should be paying me $480 a month, and he's offering, let's say, $200. That's something they can't work out. My advice is always make the application to court for 2 reasons. One, the court will review it and order that person to pay. And secondly, if they don't pay, the Sport Enforcement Agency in Corner Brook chases that person and makes sure they garnish wages. They do a litany of things that the spouse can't do.
How is alimony determined?
Well, I don't like the word alimony. Support. Spousal support. It's determined on income, both incomes, and the ability to earn more income. Like some people are educated and they are working at a reduced level and making $20,000 a year when they could be, now that they're separated, they have an obligation to try to improve their economics as well. But the factors are how much is person A making, how much is person B making, if anything, and they come to there are spousal support guidelines now that are not actually enforced by the courts, but they're used a lot of times as guidelines. So there is that benefit too, and I think eventually, in some provinces they are now actually guides, required guides for the courts to enforce. So spousal support and child support guidelines exist.
So with spousal support, is that again that stays in effect for until
circumstances change,
which could be the spouse remarries?
Exactly, spouse remarries, or the spouse is paying, has his responsibilities reduced or income reduced. Any kind of alteration in circumstances would merit a review. And they have to be, fairly significant alterations. You can't take yourself out of the workforce and say, I don't pay anymore. Some people do, and they don't pay.
Yeah.
But that's spite, and that doesn't make sense, right?
But people do it.
But people do it, But see, I'm telling you, the most potentially volatile court in this province is Unified Family Court, because that's when emotions will peak, and what was once love is now turned into a big piece of hate, and they just don't. Despite what the lawyers may be advising them, and even the court directing them, they're not able to get over that difficulty.
So, can you get a divorce without spousal consent?
Without consent, yes, in the sense that when you initiate a divorce, you have to serve the divorce petition on the spouse. That spouse has 30 days to respond. If that spouse does not respond, and most of them don't, it's assumed that they have received and have no contest in relation to the divorce.
Okay, so it becomes automatic.
It becomes automatic.
Can you represent yourself in family court? Is it advisable to do that, or should you always walk in with a lawyer?
No, unfortunately, a lot of people now, and unrepresented litigants are becoming more and more as time goes on for a number of reasons, mostly economic. They can't afford a lawyer, and they don't qualify for legal aid. So you're in this situation where you got, that essentially you don't qualify, whatever the criteria is for legal aid. You make more than you should, or that sort of thing, for that coverage, and you can't afford a lawyer. So you have to go yourself, and you'll see, unrepresented litigants all the time, and it's becoming more and more the case, and that's reflective of the system. Like the Supreme Court, very, very expensive to get into. Unified Family Court, expensive to bring a lawyer. A lot of these lawyers who do family law are specialists, and they're good.
Sure. And
they're going to charge what they feel, their worth is, and a lot of times it's beyond a lot of people.
It's certainly not advisable for one spouse, if you know your spouse having a lawyer and you walk in to represent yourself like that. That may not work out to your best interest.
No, but it's interesting because judges are the arbitrators, the mediators. They're fair. They're very fair with people who are unrepresented. They're not saying, look, you're being hosed here. They'll make sure there's a fairness is the element. And they'll make sure that person is properly, like, they'll direct them as to what they should be doing, or what they should, if you get on the stand, you have to be sworn, you have to give evidence. The judges will help them along as best they can without being their advocate. Because I've had occasions where, and not very often, but where judges became almost their advocates, and have essentially objected to the judge playing that role. And they understand that. They just get wrapped up into it and say, oh, gee, this person doesn't know what to do, and I'm going to help them.
Yeah.
And that's not their job, but they will be fair.
Okay. So explain how... you got a couple who've been married for X number of years. They decide to separate. Work pension, CPP, old age pension. How does that get divided? Is it prorated based on the amount of years that you've been married and you're entitled to so much percent of that? Just explain that, because I'm sure a lot of people, a lot of listeners don't understand. They walk in blindly and then they don't realize what family law actually says.
Well, in relation to pension, employment pension, they're divisible for the period of time they're married. So if a person has 10 years of pensionable time before they get married, and then they have 20 years of pensionable time after they separate, the 20 years is the divisible part. So it's not an equal division, it's a fractional interest.
Right.
So if it's, you're entitled to 34.5% of your husband's pension, that's what they're entitled to. And vice versa. Like the same thing if the wife has a pension. So now both of them got pensions, and there might be an inequity in it, and they balance that out.
Okay.
Canada pension, lots of people are not aware of this, but under that legislation, you cannot opt out of it. Let's say, like, you can have your pension and I'll have mine. You can, and they can live by it. But if you say, I don't want any of your Canada pension, you can't do it. Now, you can do it, but if I change my mind a year down the road and say, I want some of that money now, they can apply to the government and say, I want my share of that Canada pension.
Okay.
Can't
so
opt out.
You can change your mind at some point.
Canada pension.
Yeah.
Old age pension is not divisible, as far as I know.
Okay. Here. You hear terms of a term like mediation.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts? Would you recommend a couple go to mediation first before they
engage?
Before they engage, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then the second part of it is, would you recommend that they sit down with their lawyers, hammer this out before letting the judge, going into court and letting the judge decide?
Oh yeah, I think two things.
Right.
I think the main interest in most lawyers is see if they can settle anything, any dispute. Doesn't matter if it's marital, doesn't matter if it's contractual, doesn't matter. The reality of it is that you try to, mediate a settlement, a compromise settlement. In family law, you can actually apply to the court for directed mediation. The court, under legislation, has a right to order mediation.
Is that chargeable? Is that a fee with that?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And the judge will determine how the mediator should be paid. Usually, it's equal, but the judge assessed and they said, "Look, I think this case is ripe for mediation. Parents seem to be rational, seem to be well grounded." This shouldn't be adversarial. Let's go to mediation, and that's what they do. And you can do it personally, just privately. Don't have to go make an application.
Right. Just sit down with two immature adults.
And there are people who do mediation.
Sure.
You could do mediation.
Sure. Right. Yeah. It's just being a mature adult and figuring out that it's time to move on. I think you mentioned the only option if you're not eligible for legal aid and you can't afford a lawyer, then the only option is to represent yourself.
Go ahead, represent yourself. You're going to go to court. Now, a lot of people are intimidated by that, but once they get into the setting, judges are very sympathetic to that position. And they will make sure that you're not brought to tears or frightened to death by something. They'll calm you and work your way through.
Walking into I've gone in to fight a parking ticket.
Yeah.
I don't think I'd ever do that again. Because it is, not that it was a bad, but it was intimidating.
It's very intimidating.
Right, when you got a judge and, that is something that you wouldn't want to do every day.
Yeah, but lawyers are trained to question people. But if you put that lawyer in a position where they are being questioned as a witness, completely different atmosphere. Sure. And they are just as, concerned about it as anyone would be.
Sure, we're all human, right?
Absolutely.
Last question, or actually two more questions. Can one lawyer represent both parties?
Yes, in a straightforward, let's say, separation, and I've had this done, tens of times. But I'll bring them, and they're, amicable to a settlement, and this is what they've agreed to. And you'd say, well, look, I might say, look, I don't think that's fair, and I'll tell the person why. And they say, no, that's fine. I'm okay with that. I will do up a draft of a separation agreement, and then I'll make that person, one or the other, go to an independent legal advice, and make sure that Denis Barry, 2 years down the road, is not being accused by the wife or the husband saying, well, that was my wife's lawyer, and I was all emotional. I didn't know what I was doing. Right. The independence review gives that argument less of a base.
Right. Okay. And the final question, and I'm sure you've seen it in your years of practice, what advice can you give separating spouses with children, young children, who've decided that one of them is really hurt, and they want to use their kids as missiles. How can that backfire? Well, first of all, doing that to children is just wrong.
Yeah. Yeah.
But how do you how what advice can you give to those separating spouses when they get in to the courtroom and all of a sudden things could backfire when they do these things because they're thinking more themselves than they are about the children?
First thing the court will tell you, the judge will say to the husband and wife, I'm here to determine one thing only, what's in the best interest of those children. Now, I might not like you, and I might really like you, and won't interfere with what I think is in the best interest. And that's the whole focus. If somebody comes into court and produces evidence that the other spouse is trying to alienate their children, is trying to use their children as pawns.
It happens a lot.
A lot, all the time. It's almost like human nature.
Right.
When people get angry,
Yeah.
they also get, they
lash out.
They lash out.
Yeah.
So the reality of it is that the best place to settle this is in court. But when you go to court and say, well, my wife is trying to alienate my children, or my husband's trying to alienate my children, you better have some kind of independent confirmation of that. Whether it be audio, you can tape your conversations, texting, emails, where there's an expression of, I'm going to get you, you're not getting away with this.
Yeah.
Those children are, you're not seeing them, you're not, that kind of thing. That all helps the judge determine who in that courtroom is the better parent.
I read a quick article that a judge had written that he was presiding against a separating couple, and he said, you didn't pick the right partner. You're here. You're separating. You're divorcing. Mm-hmm. If you say to your child that their father is no good, what you're basically saying to that child is half of you is no good, because half of that child belongs to the father, and half of it came from the mother. So it kind of puts it in perspective, and kids kind of have a tendency to believe that, well, maybe if I had been a better child, my parents wouldn't be fighting, they wouldn't be divorcing, they wouldn't be. So
that's a very good issue. I mean, I don't think like that. You're thinking like that properly outside that legal envelope I'm in. The reality of it is that's very true. That child or children may feel that their daddy doesn't like them, or I that kind of thing, and that's extremely important. But it's one that unfortunately happens all the time.
And I think for all people listening, and if you're going through a situation like this, and I know it can't happen in every case, but I think every child needs a mother and a father in their lives.
Yeah, and I agree. Except if one of the parents is not fit to be a parent.
Totally, absolutely,
right?
absolutely.
I mean, there's lots of people who have kids. I sometimes puzzle myself. I say to my wife, I said, why would that person have a child?
Yeah, I know.
You're not mature, they're not responsible, they don't care, they don't live. Child needs love and understanding, and we all love our children, except those people who you question yourself, you scratch your head and say, why did they bring this child into the world? Mm-hmm.
Dennis, thanks very much. It's been a pleasure as always, and it's always nice to see you.
Great seeing you.